The encounter. The small exploration ship, Endeavour, drifted silently in the vastness of space. Dr. Elara Hayes sat in the cockpit, her heart pounding as her system screamed warnings. A massive vessel had appeared out of nowhere, blocking her path. Its dark, spiked exterior gleamed like the carapace of a predatory insect, and its sheer size dwarfed her ship. It was unmistakable. This was a Varnix warship. The Varnix were feared across the galaxy, known for their ruthlessness and lack of mercy. Stories whispered through trading hubs and outposts painted them as invincible conquerors, beings who lacked emotions but thrived on domination. Few who encountered them lived to tell the tale. Elara knew this, and her blood ran cold as the alien vessel latched onto her ship with a magnetic tether. Resistance was futile. Incoming transmission. The computer announced in its monotone voice. Elara swallowed hard and nodded, allowing the transmission to connect. The screen flickered, and a figure appeared. Sovereign Xylox, the leader of the Varnix. His elongated head was framed by a crown of bone-like protrusions, his glowing red eyes staring into her very soul. His voice was deep, rumbling like distant thunder. "Human," he began, his tone devoid of warmth. "You are an anomaly. Your species has survived where others have perished. I have questions, and you will answer them." Elara tried to keep her voice steady. "What do you want from me?" Xylox tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Your kind possesses a unique resilience, an ability to adapt and endure. I wish to understand it. Specifically, I wish to understand your method of reproduction. It is said to be unique." Her heart raced. Of all the things he could ask about, this was the last she expected. Reproduction. Why would that interest you? The alien leaned closer, his skeletal face filling the screen. "The Varnix have no use for weakness, but your species thrives on what we would consider vulnerabilities. Emotions, connections, loyalty. These traits stem from how you reproduce and bond with your offspring. I wish to see it, to understand it, and to decide if it has any value." Elara clenched her fists. This wasn't a request, it was an order. She had no choice. The Varnix could destroy her with a single command. "And if I refuse?" Xylox's expression didn't change, but his voice became even colder. "Refusal would be unwise. Comply, or your species' resilience will be tested in ways you cannot imagine." Her ship jolted as the Varnix vessel dragged it into their docking bay. The massive doors shut, cutting off the view of the stars. Elara's breathing quickened as metallic clangs echoed through her ship. The Varnix were boarding. The airlock hissed open, and a group of Varnix soldiers marched in. They were tall, their bodies covered in dark, chitinous armor. Their movements were precise, mechanical, and their weapons hummed with lethal energy. One of them gestured for her to follow. Elara stepped out of her ship, her boots echoing on the cold metal floor. The Varnix ship's interior was just as intimidating as its exterior. Endless corridors, lined with pulsating, organic machinery. The air was heavy, filled with a strange metallic scent. She was led to a massive chamber where Xylox awaited her. He stood on an elevated platform, surrounded by monitors displaying data from countless worlds. His gaze locked onto her as she entered. "Human," he said, his voice reverberating through the room. "You will show me what makes your kind unique. Begin with your method of reproduction." Elara felt a surge of defiance. "It's not something you can just observe. It's more than biology. It's about connection, trust, and emotions, things your kind wouldn't understand." Xylox's eyes narrowed. "Then teach me. If your kind's survival depends on these connections, prove their worth. Show me the strength in your weaknesses." She hesitated, her mind racing. How could she explain something so deeply human to a creature like him? More importantly, how could she protect herself while doing so? Xylox seemed genuinely curious, but his curiosity was as dangerous as his power. "Fine," she said finally, trying to buy time. "But if you want to understand, you'll need to see more than just the process. You'll need to see why it matters. Psylocke studied her for a moment, then gave a sharp nod. You have one chance to prove that your species' methods hold value. Fail, and your existence will serve no purpose. Ilara's mind spun as she was escorted to another room, this one filled with alien technology she couldn't begin to comprehend. A holographic projector stood in the center, and she realized what she needed to do. If she could show them the depth of human connection, the love, sacrifice, and bond between parents and children, perhaps she could survive this ordeal. But as the doors locked behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a trap. Psylocke and his kind didn't value emotions. How could she convince them of humanity's strength without revealing too much? The weight of Earth's survival pressed down on her as she prepared to tell the story of her species in a way that could save her life or doom her forever. The only thing she knew for sure was that the Varniks were watching, and failure was not an option. A strange curiosity. Ilara stood in the cold, dimly lit room, her breath visible in the icy air. Around her, Varnik scientists observed silently, their insect-like eyes glowing faintly in the shadows. The room's walls pulsed with an eerie organic rhythm, like a living thing. In the center, the holographic projector flickered to life, casting a pale blue light across the chamber. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of alien machinery. She looked at Sovereign Psylocke, who stood at the far end of the room, his towering form bathed in an ominous red glow. His gaze was unrelenting, a predator studying its prey. The Varnik's leader tilted his head slightly, as though he could hear her very thoughts. "You hesitate, human," Psylocke said, his voice deep and unfeeling. "Explain this process. Show me why it matters." Ilara forced herself to breathe. She had dealt with alien diplomats, scientists, even mercenaries, but none like this. The Varniks weren't just cold. They were alien in every sense of the word, devoid of empathy, driven purely by conquest and logic. Yet Psylocke's curiosity felt different, almost desperate. She activated the hologram, deciding to start with something simple, a family photograph. The image floated in the air, showing a mother, father, and child standing in a green meadow, laughing as they held hands. "This," she began, her voice trembling, "is where it begins. Reproduction isn't just a physical act. For humans, it's about creating life and nurturing it. It's about bonds that make us stronger." Psylocke's glowing eyes narrowed. "Bonds. Elaborate." The hologram shifted to a video clip of a newborn baby, swaddled in a hospital blanket, being handed to its crying mother. The mother's joy, the father's awe. It was all so raw, so human. Ilara watched the Varnik soldiers shift uncomfortably, their antennae twitching. The sight of such vulnerability was alien to them. "This is what you don't understand," Ilara continued. "Humans don't survive because we're the strongest or the fastest. We survive because of love, because we fight for each other. These emotions are our strength." Psylocke stepped closer, his claws clicking against the metallic floor. "Strength. You speak of weakness disguised as strength. How does this love ensure survival?" Ilara clenched her fists. "Love isn't a weakness. It's what drives a parent to protect their child, even at the cost of their own life. It's why we work together, why we don't give up, even in the face of extinction." Psylocke seemed to consider this, his expression unreadable. He turned to one of the scientists and gave a sharp command in the Varnik's language. The scientist pressed a series of glowing symbols on a console, and the room transformed. Holographic images of human wars, disasters, and triumphs appeared, filling the air with chaos and resilience. "You claim these bonds create strength," Psylocke said, gesturing to the scenes. "Yet your history is littered with conflict and destruction. Where is this so-called strength when your kind tears itself apart?" Ilara felt a surge of anger. "Those conflicts are part of our story, yes. But look closer. In every war, every disaster, you'll find humans helping each other, risking their lives to save others. It's not about perfection. It's about persistence. That's what makes us different. Psylocke stared at the images for a long moment before speaking. You believe these. Emotions are what set you apart. Very well. We shall test this theory. Ilara's heart sank. Test? What do you mean? Psylocke gestured to the scientists, who began adjusting the holographic projector. The images of humanity vanished, replaced by something far more sinister, a simulation of a small alien hatchling, weak and helpless, trapped in a hostile environment. You will demonstrate your so-called strength, Psylocke said coldly. You will care for this hatchling as if it were your own offspring. If your bonds and emotions are truly the key to survival, then prove it. Ilara stared at the hologram, horrified. You want me to parent a simulation? It is no simulation, Psylocke replied. This is a living Varnix hatchling, placed in a controlled environment. If your species' methods hold any value, you will guide it to survive. If you fail, it dies. The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. Ilara's mind raced. This wasn't just a test, it was a trap. The Varnix didn't understand compassion, and now they were forcing her to prove something that couldn't be measured. Worse, she had no idea what would happen if she succeeded. You're asking me to teach your kind something you've never valued, she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. What makes you think I'll do it? Psylocke leaned closer, his voice a low growl. Because the fate of your species depends on it. The hologram flickered, revealing the hatchling's fragile, translucent form. It trembled, its tiny claws scrabbling for stability on the uneven ground. Ilara felt an unexpected pang of empathy. It wasn't human, but it was alive. And it was looking to her for help. As the scientists sealed the room and the hatchling let out a pitiful cry, Ilara realized the true stakes of this encounter. She wasn't just fighting for her own survival. She was fighting to prove humanity's worth to a species that saw compassion as a flaw. And the Varnix were watching her every move. The experiment. The hatchling's cries echoed through the chamber, a sharp, haunting sound that tugged at something deep within Ilara. She knelt cautiously before the translucent creature. Its form was strange, half insect, half reptile, with fragile limbs and a pale, glowing body. It flinched at her approach, its multifaceted eyes shimmering with fear. Despite its alien appearance, it reminded her of a human infant, helpless, vulnerable, and utterly dependent. Behind the reinforced glass, Sovereign Psylocke observed intently, flanked by his scientists. The room buzzed with low murmurs in the Varnix tongue as they recorded data. Their glowing eyes betrayed no emotion, only cold calculation. You hesitate. Psylocke's voice crackled through the intercom. This is the creature you must nurture. If your bonds are so powerful, let us see them in action. Ilara clenched her jaw. It's terrified, she said, glancing up at the observation window. How do you expect it to trust me if you've made it think I'm a threat? Psylocke tilted his head. Trust is irrelevant. Survival is the only measure that matters. The hatchling's fate rests entirely in your hands. She turned her attention back to the hatchling. Its tiny claws dug into the ground as it struggled to move. The harsh lights of the chamber only made its frailty more apparent. Slowly, she extended her hand, palms open to show she meant no harm. The hatchling hesitated, its trembling form inching backward. It's okay, she whispered, her voice soft. I'm not going to hurt you. The creature paused, its small head tilting as if it understood her tone. It took a tentative step forward, then another. Finally, it reached out with one claw and touched her hand. Its skin was warm and soft, a stark contrast to its hardened exterior. In that moment, Ilara felt a spark of hope. That's it, she murmured. We'll figure this out together. Behind the glass, Psylocke watched the interaction with unblinking intensity. Interesting, he muttered. The human's tone appears to affect the hatchling's behavior. Perhaps there is merit in their emotional manipulation. One of the Varnic scientists, a tall figure with needle-like appendages, spoke. Sovereign, this bond is illogical. The hatchling gains no immediate advantage from trusting the human. Psylocke's gaze remained fixed on Elara. Logic alone does not explain their resilience. This bond may hold secrets we have overlooked. The hatchling began to chirp softly, its fear giving way to curiosity. Elara took out a ration bar from her pocket, carefully breaking off a piece. She offered it to the creature, which sniffed it hesitantly before snapping it up with surprising speed. "There you go," she said, smiling despite herself. "You're stronger than you look." The hatchling let out a low, contented trill, its glowing body pulsing faintly. Elara's heart ached at the sound. She didn't understand why, but she felt an overwhelming need to protect it. It was so small, so fragile, and completely out of place in the cold, sterile environment of the Varnic ship. But her moment of connection was short-lived. The walls of the chamber began to shift, and the ground trembled beneath her feet. Panels slid open, revealing mechanical arms and razor-sharp claws. The room was transforming into an obstacle course, with rotating blades, fire jets, and electrified barriers. "What are you doing?" Elara shouted, standing protectively in front of the hatchling. Psylocke's voice rang out. "You claim that bonds strengthen survival. Prove it. Guide the hatchling through this trial. If it survives, your claims hold value. If it fails, you both die." Elara's chest tightened. "This isn't a test. It's torture. It's just a baby. Survival knows no age." Psylocke replied coldly. "Begin." The hatchling let out a panicked screech as the first barrier activated, a spinning blade that cut through the air with a menacing wire. Elara scooped the creature into her arms and darted forward, her mind racing. The room was a death trap, designed to test not just the hatchling's instincts, but her own ability to protect it. "Stay with me," she whispered to the trembling creature. "I won't let anything happen to you." She dodged the first blade, barely missing its edge, and slid under a low-hanging barrier. Sparks flew around her as the mechanical arms reached out, trying to snatch the hatchling from her grasp. The creature clung to her, its small body trembling with fear. "Just hold on," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. The next obstacle was a series of electrified panels. Elara hesitated, scanning the path for a safe route. The hatchling chirped urgently, sensing her fear. She tightened her grip on it and took a deep breath. "You can do this," she muttered to herself. "Focus." She leaped onto the first panel, then the next, narrowly avoiding the bursts of electricity that arced through the air. Each step was a gamble, but she moved with a determination born of desperation. The hatchling's life, and her own, depended on her success. Behind the glass, Psylocke observed silently. One of the scientists turned to him. "The human exhibits high levels of stress, but continues to prioritize the hatchling's safety. This behavior is peculiar." Psylocke nodded slowly. "Peculiar, but effective. Perhaps there is more to these bonds than we anticipated." Elara reached the final obstacle, a wall of fire that surged and flickered unpredictably. The heat was intense, and the hatchling let out a terrified squeal. She hesitated for only a moment before wrapping the creature in her jacket and sprinting forward. The flames licked at her skin, but she didn't stop. Her only thought was protecting the fragile life in her arms. With a final burst of energy, she leaped through the fire and collapsed on the other side, gasping for breath. The hatchling chirped softly, unharmed but shaken. Elara held it close, tears streaming down her face. "We made it," she whispered. "You're safe." Psylocke's voice echoed through the chamber, colder than ever. Impressive. But this was only the beginning. Elara looked up, her heart sinking. She had proven her bond with the hatchling, but she knew Psylocke wouldn't stop until he had dissected every aspect of humanity's strength, and she wasn't sure how much more she could endure. Humanity's secret weapon. Elara cradled the hatchling, its soft chirps gradually calming as the chamber reverted to its cold, sterile state. Her body ached from the trials, and the heat of the fire still tingled on her skin. She wasn't sure if she felt more relief or dread. Tylox had called this only the beginning. What more could he want from her? The door to the observation room hissed open, and Tylox entered, flanked by two scientists. His towering form cast a shadow over Ilara as he approached. For a moment, he simply stared, his glowing red eyes scanning her and the hatchling. "You defied my expectations, human," he said, his voice like distant thunder. "Your determination to protect the hatchling is remarkable." Ilara tightened her grip on the creature. "It's not just determination. It's empathy. You can't understand because your kind doesn't feel it." Tylox tilted his head. "Empathy. An intangible force. Is that what you believe grants your species its resilience?" "It's not just belief," she said, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "It's proven, time and again. Empathy is why we form families, communities, and alliances. It's what makes us fight harder, even when the odds are against us." Tylox's gaze shifted to the hatchling, which was now clinging to Ilara's arm. Its translucent body pulsed faintly, a sign of its growing trust. "This hatchling displays dependency on you, yet it gains no immediate strength from the bond. Explain this contradiction." Ilara sighed. "It's not about immediate strength. It's about growth. By caring for the vulnerable, we ensure their survival until they can stand on their own. That's how we build the future." Tylox's sharp claws tapped against the floor as he considered her words. Then he turned to the scientists. "Prepare the hatchling for Phase 2. Ilara stood, alarmed. "Phase 2? What does that mean?" The scientists ignored her, their needle-like appendages darting across holographic controls. The floor beneath her shifted, and a glowing barrier formed around the hatchling, separating it from her. "No!" she shouted, slamming her hands against the barrier. "You can't take it away. It trusts me." Tylox's expression remained impassive. "Trust alone does not guarantee survival. We must test the strength of this bond under duress." The hatchling let out a panicked squeal as mechanical arms descended from the ceiling, lifting it into a smaller chamber on the far side of the room. Ilara's fists pounded against the barrier, but it was unyielding. "Don't do this," she pleaded. "You're going to traumatize it." Tylox regarded her coolly. "Trauma is irrelevant. If the bond is as strong as you claim, it will adapt." Inside the smaller chamber, the hatchling was placed in what appeared to be a simulated battlefield. The environment shifted rapidly, alternating between icy tundras, scorching deserts, and stormy wastelands. Ilara could see the tiny creature struggling to navigate the ever-changing terrain, its cries of distress piercing her heart. "This isn't a test of survival," she said, turning to Tylox. "It's cruelty." "Cruelty is subjective," Tylox replied. "The purpose of this exercise is to assess whether your presence enhances its ability to adapt." Ilara realized what he was implying. "You want me to coach it, don't you? To guide it through this insanity?" "Precisely," Tylox said. "If your bond is truly an asset, it will respond to your instructions." She gritted her teeth, her mind racing. The hatchling was terrified, overwhelmed by the chaos around it. But it was still looking to her for help, even across the distance. She had to focus. "Listen to me," she shouted, her voice carrying through the intercom. "You're stronger than you think. You can do this." The hatchling's chirps grew quieter as it seemed to focus on her voice. It hesitated, its small body trembling, before taking a tentative step forward. The tundra's icy winds howled around it. But it pressed on, following her directions. "That's it," Ilara encouraged. "Keep moving. You're doing great." Behind her, Tylox observed silently, his expression unreadable. The scientists whispered among themselves, noting the hatchling's improved performance under her guidance. As the simulation shifted to a desert, with blistering heat and shifting sands, Ilara gave more specific instructions. Stay low to the ground. Use the rocks for shade. The hatchling obeyed, its movements growing more confident. Elara felt a surge of pride, even as she fought back tears. This wasn't just about proving humanity's strength. It was about saving the life of a creature that had come to trust her. Psylocke finally spoke. Fascinating. The hatchling's success rate has increased by 37%. Your guidance appears to enhance its adaptability. It's not just guidance, Elara said, her voice trembling. It's trust. It believes in me because I've shown it that I care. That's what you don't understand. Psylocke stepped closer, his towering figure casting a shadow over her. Trust is fragile. It can be broken. Maybe, she said, meeting his gaze. But when it's real, it's stronger than anything you can imagine. The simulation ended, and the hatchling was returned to her side. It chirped weakly, its glowing body dimmer than before. Elara knelt down, wrapping her arms around it. You did amazing, she whispered. I'm so proud of you. The room fell silent, except for the faint hum of machinery. Psylocke studied the scene before him. A strange flicker of something. Curiosity, perhaps, crossing his face. Human, he said finally. You may have more to teach us than I anticipated, but this experiment is far from over. Elara looked up at him, her eyes blazing with defiance. If you want to understand humanity, you'll have to do more than run your tests. You'll have to feel. Psylocke tilted his head, his glowing eyes narrowing. Feel. Explain. You'll see, she said, holding the hatchling close. If you're brave enough. The turning point. The chamber was eerily quiet after the simulation ended, the faint hum of alien machinery the only sound. Elara sat on the cold metal floor, the hatchling trembling in her arms. Its translucent body pulsed faintly, its glow dimmer than before. She stroked its head gently, whispering reassurances. For the first time, she felt something beyond fear, a simmering anger. These aliens were playing with life as if it were a tool to dissect. Sovereign Psylocke stood in the observation deck, his crimson eyes locked on her. Your bond with the hatchling has proven useful. It survives because of you. Yet I am left with more questions than answers. Elara looked up, her exhaustion giving way to defiance. That's because you're asking the wrong questions. Survival isn't just about strength or efficiency. It's about connection, about trust and sacrifice. Your tests can't measure that. Psylocke descended the steps from his elevated platform, his claws clicking against the metal floor. Your species claims to value connection, yet your history is a contradiction. War, betrayal, destruction. These are the legacies of humanity. How do you explain that? Elara stood, cradling the hatchling protectively. Yes, we've made mistakes. We fight, we struggle, and sometimes we destroy. But in the end, we come back together. That's what makes us strong. We're flawed, but we don't give up on each other. Psylocke tilted his head, considering her words. Behind him, the Varnic scientists murmured, their expressions unreadable. One of them stepped forward, its needle-like appendages moving quickly across a glowing console. Sovereign, the scientist said, its voice sharp and mechanical. The data shows the human's bond with the hatchling increases its survival probability by 43%. However, this reliance could be a liability. If the human is removed, the hatchling's ability to adapt may fail. Psylocke turned back to Elara, his gaze piercing. A liability, then. How does humanity address this? Elara hesitated. She knew the answer, but giving it to Psylocke felt like handing a weapon to an enemy. We teach each other to stand on our own, she said carefully. We prepare the next generation to survive, to carry on what we've learned. The Varnic's leader's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his tone. Then you will teach it. The hatchling will be separated from you and tested independently. If it thrives, your species' methods may have value. If it fails, your claims will be disproven. Elara's stomach dropped. You can't just rip it away. It's not ready. It must be ready. Psylocke interrupted. Survival does not wait for readiness. The hatchling chirped weakly, sensing her distress. Elara held it tighter, her mind racing. She had to find a way to protect it. But how? She was alone, surrounded by a species that saw compassion as a flaw. Fine, she said finally, her voice steady. I'll teach it, but I need time. Psylocke regarded her for a long moment. Time is a luxury we rarely grant. Yet I am intrigued. You have 3 cycles to prepare the hatchling. After that, it will face the ultimate trial. Elara didn't ask what the ultimate trial entailed. She didn't want to know. She focused instead on the small creature in her arms. Its survival depended on her now, more than ever. The first lesson. In the days that followed, Elara dedicated herself to teaching the hatchling. She showed it how to navigate obstacles, how to find shelter, and even how to recognize danger. The hatchling was quick to learn, its movements growing more confident with each passing hour. But it wasn't just survival skills she taught. She sang to it softly when it was scared, stroked its head when it trembled, and spoke to it as if it could understand every word. The hatchling began to mimic her gestures, tilting its head when she did, chirping in response to her words. Behind the glass, Psylocke watched everything. His scientists recorded every interaction, noting the hatchling's progress. But Psylocke himself seemed distracted. For the first time, there was a flicker of something in his expression. Curiosity, perhaps, or doubt. A defiant act. On the second cycle, as Elara trained the hatchling, one of the scientists interrupted her session. It entered the chamber, its spindly legs clicking against the floor. The hatchling requires further analysis, it said coldly. Hand it over. Elara stepped back, shielding the creature. No, I'm not finished. The scientist loomed over her. You do not dictate the terms of this experiment. Before she could respond, the hatchling let out a low, guttural growl, a sound she had never heard from it before. It stood in front of her, its tiny body trembling but defiant. The scientist froze, its needle-like appendages twitching uncertainly. Psylocke's voice crackled over the intercom. Fascinating. The hatchling displays protective behavior. Continue. The scientist retreated, and Elara knelt down, her heart swelling with pride. You're stronger than they think, she whispered. Don't ever forget that. Psylocke's doubts. Later that evening, Psylocke reviewed the recordings alone. The hatchling's growth was undeniable, but something else disturbed him. He watched as Elara comforted the creature, as it responded to her touch, her voice. It was a connection he couldn't understand, a bond he had never experienced. Empathy. He muttered, the word foreign on his tongue. A strange weapon. He turned to the holographic display, which showed countless worlds the Varniks had conquered. None had resisted them. None had survived their relentless efficiency. Yet here was a species that thrived not because of their strength, but because of their humanity. For the first time, Psylocke wondered if his kind had overlooked something vital. The escape plan. The hatchling's chirps echoed softly in the dim chamber as Elara prepared for what she knew was coming. She had 3 cycles to teach it everything she could. But deep down, she knew the ultimate trial Psylocke had spoken of would be a death sentence for the fragile creature. The Varniks saw survival as a brutal gauntlet and empathy as a liability. For them, the hatchling's life was an experiment, its death a likely outcome. But not for her. Elara had made a decision. She would not let the Varniks destroy this small life to satisfy their cold, unfeeling curiosity. If the hatchling was going to survive, they had to escape. The seed of doubt. Psylocke had been observing Elara closely, more than he would admit even to himself. He had seen species grovel, fight, and die under the dominance of the Varniks, but none had reacted like her. She spoke of connection, of bonds, in ways that made no logical sense, yet the hatchling responded to her teachings in ways even he could not deny. Perhaps there is strength in this vulnerability, he murmured to himself, pacing in his private quarters. The holographic display showed the hatchling standing by Ilara's side, mimicking her gestures with eerie precision. But strength that relies on another is dangerous, isn't it? The thought lingered in his mind longer than it should have. For the first time in centuries, Sovereign Tylox felt something alien to him. Uncertainty. A desperate plan. Inside her isolated chamber, Ilara whispered to the hatchling. "Listen to me," she said, stroking its head. "We don't have much time. They're going to test you, and I can't let that happen. We're getting out of here, okay?" The hatchling chirped, tilting its head as if it understood. Its glow was brighter now, pulsing steadily, a sign of trust, of strength born from their bond. Using the scraps of materials she had managed to gather from the Varnic scientist's carelessness, Ilara had crafted a crude device to disrupt the chamber's energy field. It wasn't perfect, but it might give them the opening they needed. "Stay close to me," she whispered. "When I give the signal, we run." The moment of truth. The next day, as the Varnic scientists prepared for the final test, Ilara waited for her chance. Psylocke stood in the observation room, his imposing figure looming over the proceedings. "The hatchling has shown adaptability," one of the scientists reported, "but its reliance on the human remains a critical flaw." "Then we will see if it can survive without her," Tylox replied coldly. "Begin the trial." The chamber floor shifted, revealing a series of mechanical predators designed to mimic the most lethal creatures from conquered worlds. Blades spun, claws snapped, and the air was filled with the sound of grinding metal. The hatchling let out a frightened chirp as the first machine lunged toward it. "Now," Ilara shouted. She activated the disruptor, and the chamber's energy field crackled violently. Lights flickered as the machines stuttered, their movements momentarily freezing. Grabbing the hatchling, Ilara sprinted toward the exit. Alarms blared as the Varnic soldiers sprang into action. Psylocke watched, his expression unreadable. "She dares to defy us," he muttered, his claws tapping rhythmically. Interesting. A high-stakes chase. Ilara raced through the labyrinthine corridors of the Varnic ship, the hatchling clinging tightly to her shoulder. Behind her, the pounding footsteps of Varnic soldiers grew louder. The disruptor had bought her some time, but the ship was enormous, and the odds of finding an escape pod were slim. "Stay with me," she panted, dodging a burst of energy from a soldier's weapon. "We're almost there." The hatchling chirped urgently, its glow intensifying as if urging her forward. Rounding a corner, Ilara spotted a docking bay. A single transport ship sat waiting, its engines idle. Hope surged through her, but it was short-lived. Psylocke appeared at the entrance, his towering form blocking her path. He didn't move, his crimson eyes locked on her. "You cannot escape, human," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "You've proven much, but defiance will not be tolerated." Ilara clenched her fists, her body trembling with adrenaline. "You don't understand, Psylocke. This isn't just about survival. It's about doing what's right. Something your kind forgot a long time ago." Psylocke stepped forward, his claws gleaming in the dim light. "You speak of righteousness as if it has power, but in the face of annihilation, only survival matters." She met his gaze, her voice steady. "You're wrong. Survival without meaning is nothing, and meaning comes from protecting those we care about." An unexpected ally. As Psylocke raised his arm, ready to strike, the hatchling leaped from Ilara's shoulder. It landed in front of her, its tiny body glowing brightly. A low growl escaped its throat, a sound far more threatening than Ilara thought it capable of. Psylocke froze. The hatchling's display of defiance gave him pause, something unfamiliar stirring within him. "It protects you," he said softly, more to himself than to Ilara. "Even knowing it is weaker, it stands." "It learned that from me," Ilara said, stepping forward. "And I learned it from the people who taught me that some things are worth dying for." For the first time, Psylocke hesitated. The soldiers behind him awaited his command, but none came. Instead, he lowered his arm, and gestured to the transport ship. "Go," he said, his voice quieter than before. "But know this, the Varniks do not forget." Ilara didn't waste a second. She scooped up the hatchling and sprinted to the ship. As the engines roared to life and the vessel launched into space, she looked back through the viewport. Psylocke stood alone in the docking bay, watching her escape. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something in his expression: respect, perhaps, or even regret. A new hope. The transport ship hurtled into the void, carrying Ilara and the hatchling far from the Varnik's mothership. She leaned back in the pilot's seat, exhaustion washing over her. The hatchling chirped softly, curling up in her lap. "We made it," she whispered, stroking its head. "But this is just the beginning." Far behind her, in the cold depths of space, Psylocke stood in silence. For the first time in his long life, he questioned the path of his kind. The human had shown him something he couldn't explain, something that lingered in his mind like an unanswered question. Perhaps, he thought, there was more to survival than logic. Perhaps humanity's strength was worth understanding after all. Humanity's triumph. The transport ship sailed through the void, a small beacon of hope in the cold, dark expanse of space. Ilara sat in the cockpit, her body still trembling from adrenaline. The hatchling nestled in her lap, its soft chirps resonating like faint melodies of reassurance. They had escaped the Varnik ship, but she knew their journey was far from over. Ilara looked at the navigation system, its cracked screen flickering weakly. They were in uncharted territory, with no immediate way back to human space. Yet, despite the odds, she felt a quiet determination. Humanity had faced extinction before, and every time, they had found a way to survive. Psylocke's decision. Back on the Varnik's mothership, Sovereign Psylocke stood in his private chamber, staring at the holographic display of Ilara's escape. The scientists around him were in disarray, their voices raised in panic over the breach of security. "Sovereign," one of them said, its needle-like appendages twitching, "the human has fooled with the hatchling. Shall we dispatch a fleet to intercept?" Psylocke raised a clawed hand, silencing the room. "No," he said calmly. "Let her go." The scientists exchanged confused glances. "But Sovereign, she has shown us something we did not account for," Psylocke interrupted. "Her bond with the hatchling is not a weakness, but a strength we cannot yet comprehend. To destroy her now would be to destroy what could be the key to our evolution." The room fell silent. For the first time in Varnik's history, their leader had chosen mercy over dominance. Psylocke turned to the display, watching the faint trace of the transport ship as it vanished into the void. An unlikely ally. As Ilara piloted the ship, the hatchling stirred, its translucent body glowing faintly. She smiled down at it, brushing a finger over its head. "We'll find a way, little one. I promise." Suddenly, the ship's console beeped, signaling an incoming transmission. Ilara's heart skipped a beat as she opened the channel, expecting to see a Varnik's warship. Instead, Psylocke's face appeared, his crimson eyes unreadable. "Human," he said, his voice as calm as ever. Ilara tensed, her hand hovering over the ship's controls. "What do you want, Psylocke? Haven't you done enough?" "I am not here to harm you," Psylocke replied. "I wish to offer assistance." Her eyes narrowed. "Why would you help me?" "Because you are correct," he said, surprising her. "Your species possesses something we do not, a strength born from connection. The Varniks have conquered countless worlds, yet we remain stagnant. Your methods may be what we need to evolve." Ilara shook her head, disbelief evident in her expression. "You tortured us, experimented on us, and now you expect me to trust you." "No," Psylocke said simply. "I expect you to survive. Whether you trust me or not is irrelevant. I am sending coordinates to a nearby outpost where you will find safety. What you do with them is your choice." Before she could respond, the transmission ended, leaving her staring at the flickering console. The coordinates appeared moments later, glowing faintly on the screen. She hesitated, torn between suspicion and hope. The hatchling chirped softly, nudging her hand. She sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Looks like we're taking a leap of faith. A fragile alliance. The outpost was a small, abandoned station orbiting a dying star. As Ilara docked the transport ship, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hatchling clung to her shoulder as she explored the station, finding supplies and a working communication terminal. She sent a distress signal to the nearest human colony, hoping someone would respond. Hours passed in tense silence. But finally, a familiar voice crackled through the terminal. "This is the UHS Valor. We've received your signal. Identify yourself." Relief flooded through her. "This is Dr. Ilara Hayes. I have critical information about the Varnics. Please, you need to pick me up immediately." The response was swift. "Coordinates received. We're en route. Hold tight. A lesson for the Varnics." Back on the Varnics mothership, Kylox stood before his council. The other leaders watched him with suspicion, their insect-like eyes glinting in the dim light. "You allowed the human to escape," one of them hissed. "Explain yourself." Kylox stepped forward, his voice steady. "The human has shown us what we lack. Empathy, trust, sacrifice. These are not weaknesses, but strengths we must learn to harness. If we continue on our path, we will remain conquerors, but we will never evolve." The council murmured in discontent, but Kylox raised a hand. "If we are to dominate, we must understand our adversaries. The human has provided us with a gift, a perspective we cannot ignore. Let her survival be the beginning of a new era. Humanity prevails." When the UA's Valor arrived, Ilara was exhausted but determined. She handed over the data she had gathered on the Varnics, including recordings of their experiments and their fascination with human resilience. "This isn't just about us," she told the captain. "The Varnics are changing. They're starting to question their own methods. We need to be ready for what comes next." The hatchling chirped, earning curious glances from the crew. Ilara smiled softly. "And we need to remember what makes us strong. Our ability to connect, even with those who are different. A glimmer of hope." As the Valor set course for the nearest colony, Ilara looked out the viewport, the hatchling nestled in her arms. The stars stretched endlessly before them, each one a reminder of the vastness of the universe and the resilience of humanity. Far away, in the dark reaches of space, Kylox stood alone in his chamber. He stared at a hologram of Earth, his mind racing with possibilities. For the first time in his long life, he felt something almost human, a sense of wonder. Perhaps, he thought, there was more to life than survival.